Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kathy Buechel, and I'm the editor of A Gift of Belief, and I'm the host for our conversation this afternoon. So welcome to our conversation with the authors of A Gift of Belief, Philanthropy and the Forging of Pittsburgh. In our book, 12 authors take us beyond the traditional images of industrial titans, the better-known philanthropists of Pittsburgh's history, to reveal how everyday individuals and communities also work together to mobilize their private resources intended for the public good. Our book offers a more expansive view of philanthropy in Pittsburgh. In a region known for urban challenges and reinvention, private philanthropists are often considered integral to the region's resilience. Pittsburgh stood at the epicenter of America's seismic changes in the 19th and 20th century. And you know the litany: frequent epidemics, commercial downturns, rapid industrialization, urbanization, waves of immigration. All of these things took their toll on Pittsburgh's infrastructure and its people. Individual philanthropists organized to help their neighbors in need during these times of crisis and sustenance. They mobilized relief during hard winters and epidemics. They came together collectively in congregations, in whole communities, in neighborhoods, to found the charitable institutions that created an impressive grassroots safety net to help the community cope and eventually to prevail. Many people know one side of Pittsburgh's philanthropic story: the role of industrial titans in fostering parks, cultural and educational institutions. Today, we're talking with authors who tell the other, lesser known but equally important part of Pittsburgh's philanthropic saga: the work of individuals, women and African Americans, whole communities and congregations who advocated for change and who lifted up people in their giving and through collective action. We label this work advocacy and agency, and we're pleased to welcome Jessie Ramey, author of Gender Dimensions of Philanthropy, and Tony Macklin, author of a chapter on the use of advocacy and philanthropy in Pittsburgh. And I'm here as your host and facilitator, but also as another author because I penned a chapter exploring associated charities or federated philanthropy and attempts to uplift the poor. We've asked each author to summarize the chapter in 3 or so minutes, maybe 4, and perhaps this is the toughest challenge we've issued to them because their chapters are so rich and they've contributed so much to the history of Pittsburgh. Then we'll ask a few overarching questions that speak really to this idea of advocacy and agency. And please use the chat function as questions arise. And we'll be sure to circle back to incorporate your questions into our conversation. For our discussion, advocacy is defined as donors and foundations using tools of public education and advocacy to influence public policy, reform government services, address inequity, or unlock social change in the Pittsburgh region. Agency describes the offering of tools and resources for stabilizing, advancing the self-determination and well-being of a person, a specific community, or an entire region. Those are broad definitions, perhaps, but they're powerful framing, as we'll see from these authors. So welcome, and welcome to Jessie Ramey, who is director of the Women's Institute and an associate professor of women's and gender studies at Chatham University. A noted historian, Jessie wrote the chapter on Gender Dimensions of Philanthropy and has shared a powerful story of women's role as individual donors, charitable institution builders, and foundation founders. Jessie, hello, welcome. And can you start us off by summarizing your chapter and how it reflects this theme of agency and advocacy?
Absolutely. Kathy, thank you again so much for having us here today and for this beautiful book that we were all just holding in our hands. It's just such a work of art and it's such a testament to your hard work. So thank you for starting us off and for pulling us together today for this conversation. So as you alluded to in the opening, women were and are absolutely crucial to philanthropy. We often hear so little about them, though, when we're thinking about this subject. So this chapter really starts by considering the question, does gender matter? In other words, is there something unique about women's philanthropic activity compared to men's? The short answer is yes. And actually, we know that from contemporary data that there are real differences between women and men and their approach to giving. And in fact, when you start looking at the history of philanthropy, you realize that you really can't tell the full story without looking at the significant levels of women's participation and the different ways that women built philanthropic institutions. So this chapter takes a look at 3 aspects of women's philanthropy, which were all crucial to the development of Pittsburgh as a city, but also to really to the nation. So in other words, what was happening here in the Steel City was happening in other cities, and Pittsburgh was really a leader with some of these trends. So the first of the 3 groups that I looked at was the contributions of women as individual philanthropists. So these were mostly very wealthy women who made their mark through significant financial gifts of property, right? Like this fairly traditional definition of philanthropy, the way we're often accustomed to thinking about philanthropy. But I also looked at the role of women in founding and managing a wide range of benevolent institutions. And these are the organizations such as orphanages, hospitals, old age homes that really formed the basis of the modern nonprofit sector. And throughout the book, we actually use an expanded definition of organized philanthropy to help us think about these 3 T's, right? We call them the donation of time, talent, and treasure. And when you use that broader lens to look at charitable giving, you can really see the enormous participation of women in philanthropic activity. And that cuts across lines of race, class, age, ethnicity, immigration status, religion, right? Then there's a 3rd group, and that was women who established formal foundations. So we take a look at some formal foundations as well. And then the other thing that this chapter does is that it applies what we would call an intersectional gendered lens to all of this work. So what does that mean? Well, for instance, it considers how race and class intersect with the way that women were giving in ways that make women's philanthropic activity quite distinct. I also looked at motivations for women's giving, as well as the way that philanthropic work sometimes actually challenged traditional gender roles and traditional sort of gendered systems of power. And at other times, philanthropy worked to maintain those traditional gender roles and systems. So that, in a nutshell, is what the chapter is about.
Terrific. And so that'll lay some groundwork for us to discuss these topics very well. And so I'm going to turn now to Tony Macklin, if I can. Tony has been executive director of the Roy A. Hunt Foundation here in Pittsburgh and was a staffer at foundations in Indiana before that. He currently advises families and foundations on how to increase the impact of their philanthropy. Tony contributed a chapter in A Gift of Belief on the interplay of philanthropy and public policy, specifically exploring how foundations have used public education and policy work to change systems and tackle large-scale social issues. Tony, welcome, and please share a chapter of your summary, a summary of your chapter and how it reflects our topic today of agency and advocacy.
Thank you, Kathy. It's great to be on this and great to be back in Pittsburgh for now about 3 months and see some familiar names in the attendee list today. The chapter that I wrote sort of has 3 parts. The first part covers some history of the intertwining of philanthropy and public policy, or philanthropy and government agencies. It's a long, decade-old soap opera where people are in love with each other, they hate each other. We don't see any evil twins as far as I know, but otherwise it's just sort of this sort of tussle about power and control and ideas and who gets to say what about what happens in the public realm. And Pittsburgh was a microcosm of the national conversations and arguments around the power of philanthropy and public policy, and so where the breaks are between those or types of sectors. It then introduces 2 frameworks that the field of foundations had been using to articulate what does public policy and advocacy work look like. foundations and donors had always been involved in advocacy and public policy in some ways, but we didn't have great ways of talking about it. And in the early 2000s, the Annie E. Casey Foundation and the James Irvine Foundation outside of Pittsburgh laid the groundwork nationally for some frameworks to say, here's the different kinds of activities that can move public policy along and how foundations and nonprofits work along those kinds of frameworks. So it gave us a way to look at how to measure progress and success in public policy work. The third and largest part of the chapter then dives into some stories of local foundations and how they use different parts of those frameworks or different kinds of activities to advocate and move policy along. So you've got the FISA Foundation, the Women and Girls Foundation, and the Poise Foundation as smaller foundations that had sort of an outsized influence locally and with their philanthropic colleagues. And then the 7 private foundations that were created by the Scaife family and both their local and regional impact and certainly their national impact on the conservative movement. And you see different windows of how they looked at their relationship with advocacy and public policy issues, and different windows in how they saw agency in their grantees or in the people their grantees were working with. You could probably say that you had both liberal and conservative viewpoints on what agency and self-determination mean, and you sort of had those probably conflicting along the way and within the chapter, although we probably didn't cover that as well as we could have along the way. So that's the basics of it, and you can get all the details in the stories as you get into the chapter in our conversation.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tony. And I'm Kathy Buechel. I introduced myself at the top of our conversation, but I've served as a philanthropic leader for now almost 30 years, working first at Alcoa Foundation and now the Benter Foundation, where I'm executive director. And for the last 13 years, I've been senior lecturer and founder of the Philanthropy Forum at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at Pitt. And I'm the editor of this book. And I wrote a chapter on associated charities, which explored how Pittsburghers came together collectively to vet and coordinate services to the poor in ways that reflect the approaches of scientific philanthropy at the time. And my chapter summarizes the historic context. It really looks back at the evolution of scientific philanthropy and charity. And the point of that is that Pittsburgh led the nation in so many ways in scientific philanthropy, but lagged in one, which is the creation of associated charities or charities, organizations, societies. So I looked at the context in which that movement began to thrive. It started in Germany, moved to England, and was spawning the first charity organizations, societies, or associated charities in Buffalo in 1877. And the movement essentially adopted some of the systems that were extant in business at the time, using data, diagnostic tools, the creation of new knowledge through research, and the professionalization of social sciences and things like social work to really get to the root cause, it thought, of poverty and the conditions of the poor. And it did so through a system of having friendly visitors come and meet with families who were in need, and then document the outcome of those interviews, and then use that to diagnose a cure. Like, they considered themselves social physicians. And the cure could be the coordination of resources from a number of agencies in the community. They did not see themselves in associated charities as providers of service, but coordinators. And another part of this was to give just enough support for what the family needed, nothing more and nothing less. And they wanted to award and support the worthy poor, those who could bootstrap themselves forward. And they wanted to downplay long-term dependence on charity. So they were very worried about this. And also scatteration. They were scathing in their criticism of donors who distributed their funding sentimentally, without data and without evidence and without coordination. And so they had as their goal the self-sufficiency of families and a freedom from charity. So a job and a hand up were all that they believed that they were doing. But of course, as you may imagine, there was a downside to all of this. It came down to judgment and certain norms and values, which didn't take into account different ways of living, etc. So my chapter looks at both those fundamentals and the late arrival of associated charities in Pittsburgh, which took more than 30 years. Keep in mind, Buffalo started in 1877. We didn't establish one until 1908. And so that runs contrary to the narrative of collaboration that is so endemic as we describe Pittsburgh philanthropy. And so the chapter looks at how collaboration was so hard won, how it fell apart, and why the chapters of use, and that's the final part of the chapter, is to look at what it spawned. And it spawned agencies that exist today. The community chest movement grew out of associated charities because the associated charities crossed all kinds of economic terrains. Jessie talked about women's giving, but this looked across geography, social strata, laboring groups were part of it, different religious congregations. So it was the really foundation of what became the United Way in our community. So with that, I'll stop. And I think that there are some common themes that we've seen in our discussion today. And I hope that we can, the three of us, weave in some of the wonderful work that Jared Day, who did a chapter on African-American philanthropy in Pittsburgh, and Loretta Lobes, who looked at the early sectarian philanthropy that predates much of our book. I think we can also incorporate some of their themes in this work. So let's jump in if we can. And to both Jessie and Tony, I want to ask you this question about the continuum of charity and philanthropy. You know, we tend to think of charity as something that's immediate and relief in the moment, meeting immediate needs, and then philanthropy as something that's longer term, looking at systemic or root causes. Who were the protagonists in your chapter, and how did they navigate this continuum? Were they skewed in one direction or the other? Jessie, how about you? Do you want to start us off on that one?
Sure, I'd be happy to take a crack at this. Boy, I had a lot of protagonists in my chapter. So as I'm thinking about how to answer this question, Kathy, I think maybe let me talk about two women, maybe as an entry point into thinking about this tension between, long-term or immediate, right? So let's talk about the two Jane Holmes, in part because I love these women and I would love for everybody to know more about them. But I think they really provide some good examples, particularly of 19th century women's philanthropy and this tension that you're talking about. So these were two cousins. They were actually known as Pittsburgh Jane and Baltimore Jane to tell them apart. They never married, but they were highly engaged in a truly impressive range of philanthropy here in the Pittsburgh region. So let me just give you some quick examples and we can think about maybe how this plays out. All right. So for example, back in 1869, both of these women were actively working with the Women's Christian Association, which was the foremother of the YWCA, to raise funds for a home for aged Protestant women. So an old age home, right? Think about the amounts of money too that we're talking about. Pittsburgh Jane gave the home over $87,000 when she died. Baltimore Jane was actually serving as the home's president. When she died, she left them also a lot of money. That home was later named the Rebecca Residence and it's still operating today, right? So one of the things Kathy mentioned is sort of the long tail on a lot of these organizations. It's part of the Concordia system just north of the city. I'm going to give you just a couple more examples of what they did so we can, again, think about this tension in their work. They helped to start the Home for Colored Children, as it was called back in 1880, which was actually the only child welfare organization serving Black families in Southwest Pennsylvania until well after the turn of the century. That group continues today to serve families in need as part of Three Rivers Youth. Pittsburgh Jane actually donated her family's summer estate. If you can imagine Lawrenceville being a summer estate, it was 16 acres there to form the Protestant Home for Incurables. She also helped to start Children's Hospital. Think about all these organizations. I'm just going to list a couple of them again. West Penn Hospital got a lot of her resources, Protestant Orphan Asylum, Pittsburgh and Allegheny Home for the Friendless, which is now Presley Ridge. a homeopathic hospital and Pittsburgh Free Dispensary that's now part of Shadyside Hospital. I could go on and on. There's sort of numerous examples of these organizations, right? So you get a sense of the range of needs that these two Jane homes were trying to meet. Essentially what we would recognize today, right, as health and human services, child welfare services, but these systems didn't exist yet. So I see their work as both sort of charitable in the immediate sense, right, meeting these immediate needs in the community, but also literally creating the social support systems that would develop throughout the 20th century. That was perhaps a long answer, but it's really this interesting tension in there. I love that question.
Yeah, good. How about you, Tony? Can you offer us some protagonists that kind of build on the groundwork that Jessie has laid for us?
First, good that you put this idea, the sort of charity and philanthropy or strategic philanthropy. It's a continuum, right? We've spent a lot of time in philanthropy making it a versus, and most donors end up doing a bit of both anyway, whether they plan to or not. And the same is true for the foundations that I worked with in my chapter. Especially for the smaller ones, FISA and the Women and Girls Foundation and Poise, up until maybe the past few years, they were really playing roles that were very niche and not paid attention to by larger foundations. So people with disabilities, girls empowerment, girls and women having a voice in what's going on in the community, Black-led organizations and Black-led philanthropy. And so they almost had to play multiple purposes because they were the major funders of this particular kinds of populations. And until they were able to catch the voice and attention of other foundations, say, you need to be doing something here too, then they could tilt more into maybe more systemic work. I think all of them had systemic work at their roots and in their grant making, but they were probably forced into lots of other foundation or funder roles just because of who they were in the system or the ecosystem of funders. Women and Girls as a foundation probably especially leaned into the systemic work a little bit earlier. You think about the Scaifes, Cordelia Scaife and Richard Mellon Scaife, as individuals and through their foundations, they probably funded across the continuum too. They funded organizations that were very immediate, food banks, social service organizations, family service kinds of organizations more locally, but maybe as you looked at the national landscape or at least the statewide landscape, they thought much more systemically. And so much more of their grant making at the national and state level were on the public policy and systems change kind of work. Even if they wouldn't have used that language, they were thinking more in that sort of long-term traction kind of work. And so you saw very little of them funding a food bank or a social service organization in some other state. They sort of kept that in their hometown in some way. So they had both, but they looked at it from different angles depending on the geography.
Well, in my case, it's interesting to hear you say that because you think about Associated Charities, that was the name of it. It begins with this desire to ameliorate the condition of poverty and to do away with charity. And so they thought they were scientifically pursuing this. And they used the tools of that, what we have seen as modern tools of advocacy. They had public meetings, they galvanized support, they brought in national experts, they benchmarked and did studies. And I know that in your case, Tony, you talked about a number of research studies and how that led to policy change. And in Jessie, some of the institution builders that you profiled did the same, used the same kind of tools. And I link that to advocacy and toward that continuum of what we've thought about as systems change in philanthropy through the Associated Charities continuum. You know, I also think of in Mary Brignano's chapter, the discussion of the Pittsburgh survey, which is a social science methodology, and how they documented conditions in Pittsburgh, again, funded by local philanthropists and of course the Russell Sage Foundation. But then they promulgated these findings in Pittsburgh with museum expositions, with photographic expositions, 6 publications which have become landmark, public speeches, newspaper articles, the tools and you know, public discussions of civic issues and civic problems and a platform for how to change them. And while the Pittsburgh survey languished in Pittsburgh and caused an outcry, it really set the stage for tools that, Tony, I think people in your chapter used to engage with public officials and to try to move the needle on everything from air quality to drinking water to safe playgrounds for children. So in our chapter, I think you see some of these tools, and I think the desire to move away from charity and to think more about advocacy and systems change on that broader spectrum there. Has your chapter work enabled you to think differently about philanthropy in the space we're describing right now? I mean, have you seen its power or its shortcomings differently based on the work you've done and the kinds of things that you've brought forward for us?
I think the chapter to me clarified that any piece of philanthropy, whether it's individual donors, collectives of donors, or if they formalize their philanthropy through a foundation or a donor advised fund or something, share the same goal of influence as people who are in public policy work, whether it's an advocacy organization or a legislator or a political campaign of some kind. And this idea of influencing other people's thoughts and behaviors and attitudes around issues is so important in American life, and it's so important to how philanthropy and public policy work together. But the influence work is a long slog, and it's hard to track, and it's not linear. And so it can be easy for individual donors or for foundations to sort of lose the thread or to get impatient about what they're working on. And you see in your chapters and other chapters, Jessie's chapters, that the patience of foundations who worked decades on something, and even in my chapter, to lay the groundwork for, we're going to keep working on this no matter the tides of elections, no matter the tides of public sentiment, no matter the tides of money going up and down from government or philanthropy. So I think this issue of both influence and the patience around it are things that get highlighted for me and lessons that we often lose as we practice philanthropy even today.
Jessie, how about you? How do you see that? You know, any takeaways about the use of philanthropic resources and what can be accomplished with them?
Yeah, sorry, I was unmuting. I think in the best cases, thinking about specifically around women in this chapter, right? What women in Pittsburgh were able to do with their philanthropy was to create these long-lasting organizations, and in some cases, new approaches. And I think that's one of the things I found very inspiring. Tony looked at the FISA Foundation, right, and pioneers in supporting women recovering from childbirth, surgery, illness. That focus on convalescence was new. It wasn't something that other groups were doing. In fact, this whole idea of convalescence was sort of a new idea, a new concept. There were no institutions in Pittsburgh offering that kind of healthcare, particularly not to working class women and particularly not to unmarried women. So we've got very little sympathy anywhere else. So thinking about some of that as really interesting ways that folks have contributed. I also think it's notable that the FISA Foundation and the Women and Girls Foundation is another good example, right, are now working, as Tony said, to create more systemic change.
Yeah. I wonder if we could also reflect for a minute in terms of your work on the use of non-financial capital. We tend to think of philanthropy as all about money. Or whoever, the golden rule, he who has the gold sets the rules. But in fact, your chapters both show uses of non-financial resources that are powerful agents of change. I wonder if you could share some of those examples with us. Jessie, I think in terms of your work, to me, it was so touching to read about women sending in canned goods from their garden and sewing. I wonder if you can talk about that.
Yeah, as we think about particularly the women who were involved in starting and running some of these organizations like the orphanages, the old age homes, hospitals, right? they relied on broad networks of women, in some cases, if they were religiously affiliated organizations, ladies' aid societies within churches. And that allowed women way out in the countryside, right, to can peaches or sew clothes and do other kinds of labor within the home, and then provide those goods to literally support these organizations. So an awful lot of charitable work, what I would call philanthropic work, right, networked together to support these institutions. So I think that's a really important way of thinking about working class women and even middle class women's way of engaging with this kind of philanthropy. And then, of course, even more broadly, thinking about the way the women who were running these organizations, I'm often blown away by the amount of time that these women put into these organizations. In fact, again, remember, long before women had the right to vote, these are mostly politically disempowered folks until 1920. White women don't have the right to vote until 1965. Black women really don't have the right to vote in this country. So without formal political power, women using these organizations, in fact, often working like a full-time job, highly skilled, going to the state legislature and lobbying for legislation, buying real estate, doing all kinds of things one might find pretty hard to do without kinds of formal political power. So very broad ways of thinking about philanthropy here with women and their engagement.
It's interesting, Jessie, you mentioned the 3 T's in your chapter, and it's really the women's funding movement, and then expanded that over the past couple of decades to 5 T's, right? Time, talent, treasure, and they added testimony and ties. And that's been picked up by a number of other philanthropic organizations. And I think that categorizes as well what you wrote about, what Kathy wrote about, and even this kind of public policy work. So you're really using your testimony and your ties to pull other people into X, whatever X is that you're working on. I think about the foundations in my chapter. They did convening, spent time and money on convening. They spent time on coalition building, this kind of long slog work of getting everybody on the same page and identifying common goals and the rest of it. Lots of time spent on training other organizations to think about things differently, or to build up skills on advocacy or working with people with disabilities, or pick an issue. The CEOs of these foundations and many of their board members spent time volunteering with other organizations and involved in other advocacy organizations to really listen in on what was going on in those organizations and bringing that back. And even the Scaife family, the brother and sister, probably less time on that kind of convening and training from a personal standpoint. They kept pretty lean shops, but they had their hands pretty deep in a few grantees. And that was some direct influence work, and also a chance for them to listen into public policy issues that were coming up from Republican circles, conservative circles, and bringing that back into their boardrooms or into their own thinking. They might have leaned a bit more into that "he who has the gold makes the rules" piece of their grant making, but they were at least listening in to a close set of partners, maybe versus a larger, broad set of partners of it. So I think it's convening, coalition building, collaboration, training, all those kinds of things that help bring people along.
Yeah. One of the things that we saw in several of your, in several parts of both of your chapters, is something that we have thought of as a modern invention of philanthropy, which is this engagement of recipients of philanthropy as partners. We think that philanthropy just invented that, and that until recently, nobody paid attention to stakeholders, and nobody thought they should be co-creators. In the case of associated charities, that was perhaps true. We didn't listen, or the proponents of this movement didn't listen exactly to the agency, exhibited by the clients they were interviewing. They imposed the solutions they thought were right. There was not a sense of co-creation, and some have even criticized the settlement houses for doing some of that same thing. But Jessie, I think you know some examples from your orphanage work and even from your chapter where we don't see that idea of top-down. We see this idea of co-creation. I wonder if you and Tony can talk about that. Tony, certainly you can bring that through with FISA and some of the other examples. But Jessie, are there some examples you'd talk about where recipients are in fact partners?
Well, let's talk about the orphanages. I think that those are an interesting example. I'm not sure if I'm going to go as far as saying partner. Let's figure out if that's the right word or not together. But
fantastic.
But I think that often we consider these organizations, and historians have considered them as sort of top-down, controlling the poor, right? Or kinds of organizations, perhaps even run by well-meaning middle-class or elite women. Although in the case of Pittsburgh orphanages, what the evidence suggests is that there were a lot of what we might consider lower middle class and even working class women on these boards. So they kind of challenge a lot of our assumptions about who was actually running the organizations. But in a lot of ways, parents were really using orphanages for their own needs and were constantly negotiating with the managers to get what they needed from these organizations. So there's a lot of agency, right? The way the historians would use the word agency, of parents, of negotiating over how much it would cost, the timing of their payments. Parents were staying very involved with their children. These are all perhaps surprising things if you haven't thought about the ways that parents really were using orphanages as a form of childcare in this early period, right? So they're negotiating, they're very engaged, but I don't want to overemphasize their power. So orphanages and their managers still had probably more power than parents. So I don't think this is an era in which we can think about them as co-equals, but I think it's very interesting to see the ways in which parents, working class parents in particular, their demands were shaping these institutions through their use of them, right? I think that's important. And the families were really striving to use these philanthropic resources for their own needs, and in making demands on them really wound up kind of shaping the system. But I'm not sure that we can see them as co-equal partners in creating that system.
I think that's fair. I'll temper. I withdraw my partnership language and remember from whence we all came. But I think what you're showing, though, is some agency from people who adapted, who made the systems offering care adapt to their needs. And I see that as empowering, or at least a flexing of their own voices and needs.
Absolutely. And we historians love that word agency. It's important. Yeah.
How about you, Tony? You've got some examples, I think, that may skew closer to partnership language. Is that right?
I think so. I mean, the FISA Foundation's roots, intertwined with disabilities rights community, brings this phrase of nothing about me without me, or nothing for me without me, and they lived that value system in their grant making, in the way they develop strategies, in the way they would work with grantees or other partners, say you really need to be listening and bringing people in, not just listening, but including them in the decision making as much as you can. And you saw them influence other foundations like the Arts Council or other folks to really think about how are you fully inclusive of people with disabilities, not only in programming, but also in the decision making about like arts grants or other kinds of things. And so they really lived that value system out, probably more than any other funder in town in some ways. Women and Girls Foundation did it with young women in leadership institutes and putting them in the forefront of advocating for their own needs locally and at the state legislature. They were sort of the first people to really bring young girls' voices to the legislators in Harrisburg, and helping women sort of think about and advocate for their own rights, for parental leave, or a whole bunch of issues over the course of a couple of decades. Poise Foundation is of and by its community, the Black donor community and Black nonprofit community. So maybe they didn't have as formalized systems as the FISA Foundation did, but they were really close to the roots of their history and of their community, and taking in lots of what other foundations might call small donors. And so they were always listening in to people who were probably both donors and close to the ground of, gosh, I see this problem in my neighborhood or in my township or something. Mm-hmm. So they did that. They did a more formal listening process in the early 2010s that really got them out in the community in a more formalized way to say, what is really the state of our Black community and how do we move things forward? And so they picked up the pace on that in the 2010s in some way. So I think all three of those foundations, especially, they're not highly staffed foundations. So they did a lot of work getting out and listening and including and being of and by their communities without a lot of human power to really do that kind of work, compared to really large foundations that have lots of program officers that can do that work for them.
Yeah. Jessie, it wasn't only foundations that were doing some of that. If I'm not mistaken, we have examples in the book of Black women's service organizations that are listening to the community and amplifying and speaking out for needs, whether it's fresh air camps or some other things to bring resources into the community. I wonder if you have a comment on that aspect of the book and the work that has been elevated in the Black community by women's service organizations.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of Black women and their history of organizing, not only here in Pittsburgh, but nationally for the needs of the community, is such a strong thread through a number of our chapters and just really important work to lift up and remember. I'm also thinking, Kathy may have been referring to the giving circles that we've talked about, right? Which is so interesting because they're growing in popularity again, but that practice really comes right out of Black women's collective giving traditions. And it's essentially a form of participatory philanthropy, right? Where individuals are donating money or time to a pooled fund and then deciding together where to give it away. So that comes right out of this strong tradition in the Black community. They're cooperative kind of economic practices that Black women have historically used to build wealth and sustain community institutions. So what we're doing is practicing an alternate form of kind of collective economics, right? So interesting to think about as we think about philanthropic giving and practices today.
Yeah, for sure.
Love giving circles.
I think you're both talking, giving circles for sure. And, I think you both talked about scale in a different way. Again, we tend to think of philanthropy in the more traditional sense as large scale, big grants. And I think both of your chapters really do a beautiful job of showing the power of what we might consider small scale efforts to make big scale change. And just even the institutions that some of the women you cited founded really spoke to people who were not served by the charities of their time. And Tony, in the case of some of the advocacy you talked about, certainly the issues were hidden from the mainstream agendas. Is there anything you want to say about scale, the value of small and sort of grassroots efforts versus what we tend to think of as replicable and large scale efforts?
I think the short thing I can say is never underestimate the power of a focused donor or a focused small foundation. If they've got a focus to that, they can have outsized impact. It doesn't have to take a lot of staff or a lot of money. The donors that Jessie talked about sometimes were not the largest donors in any other chapters. So sometimes it's just the focus and the passion that makes the difference rather than the size and scale.
Okay. Jessie, any thoughts on that? Scale. I think you're on mute, or am I on mute?
Tony wrapped that one up beautifully.
All right, good. I wonder
Kathy,
if we can talk about some. Go ahead.
So we have some questions from the audience. Do we want to take those? I know we've got a lot of other things.
We do actually. I was going to turn to those right now for sure. And so we have one question about younger generations thinking about philanthropy in new ways. Have you seen a parallel to how past generations thought about philanthropy?
Jessie, I'm curious, what are you seeing from young people on campus as young philanthropists and activists?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm seeing, we've been having this conversation about partnering with the community, right? And thinking about sort of the historical threads here is recognizing that really what we need already exists in the community. So this idea, I think a lot of this comes too from the history of Black women's philanthropy, but teaches us that really the knowledge, the wisdom, the experience, the know-how are right here in the community, right? So the things that we need are already with us, and that philanthropy just needs to tap into the solutions that already exist in our community.
Mm-hmm. I have a question. Go ahead, Tony.
I was like, talking with younger family members of family foundations over the past couple of years and younger donors, they're tuned in pretty quickly to power structures and they're tuned in pretty quickly to sort of this idea of we all need to work together on something, whether we're of different classes or races or ages or the rest of it. And so they go back to this root of collective philanthropy and collective action pretty quickly, even if they've got some other kind of formal tool that their family might be working for. So I think that's come back around and pretty intuitive for younger generations.
I have a question from the audience that relates to the comments you've both just made about new tools of philanthropy. Partly technology, which kind of circumvents the need to have intermediaries, right? You can see a need and be connected as a donor directly to that need, whether through online giving schemes or loan funds, Kiva, et cetera. What do we see in terms of these new structures, either technology or Tony? This question is about many families and foundations working on advocacy through donor advised funds or other structures. So can we talk a little bit about that to answer a question from one of our audience members about these new structures, specifically in terms of advocacy?
Yep. So two different pieces there, right? Donor advised funds have a lot of legal restrictions attached to them that make them a bit less flexible in terms of working in advocacy and public policy issues, at least through that fund. Now you can make grants to nonprofit organizations, charitable organizations that are doing that kind of work, and that works okay. Or you as a donor who are the sponsor of that fund or funder of that fund can do all the lobbying and advocacy you want to do. You're just not necessarily wearing the hat of your donor advised fund. And you certainly see many donors be politically active and give through their donor advised funds and give individually to campaigns or political contributions of some kind outside of, through their own checkbooks or Visa cards or something. So I think you see people blending them, but maybe don't use the donor advised fund as formally that some foundations might. The crowdfunding platforms and technology platforms have accelerated what we've always done, gathered people's energy and money together, but now we can find anybody across the world to gather with. Even the Philanthropy Together I put in the chat, this sort of international platform for finding giving circles. You can now join a giving circle anywhere and pool your money and time with folks, or you can go to a crowdfunding campaign. So I think accelerated people's agency, back to that word, right? Our self-agency to be a donor, an activist who can get something done without having to wait for a formalized blessing from whomever, or without having to have a formalized tool in the traditional philanthropic sense, a foundation, a United Way, a whatever else. So we all get to be, what was the term that the researcher Paul Shervis called, hyper agents. We can all set our own destinies for making an impact in the world.
Mm-hmm. Jessie, do you think the Jane Holmeses saw themselves as hyper agents?
Boy, that's an interesting question. I wish that I could go and have a cup of tea with them, frankly, and ask them some of these questions. So I don't want to put words in their mouths, but I think that they were typical and atypical for their time, and particularly in the breadth and depth of their giving, and to the number of organizations, and particularly the kinds of folks that they were supporting who didn't receive support elsewhere. So I don't know if they'd recognize the term, but wish I had a time machine. All historians wish we had time machines, but it would be just marvelous to go back and be able to ask some of the founders of these organizations how they view
Jessie,
that.
we have exactly. We have a question kind of related to this for you specifically, and it speaks to your current role at Chatham. What do you hope the young men and women on campus know about their antecedents that we're discussing today in Pittsburgh? And how are young people building on the legacy of the women who came before them?
Oh, that's a marvelous question. And it's sort of asking a historian why history matters, right? So, of course, I think this history is terribly important. We really can't understand the systems that we are trying to tackle today, right? If we're looking at economic inequality or political inequality or social inequality, we really can't understand those inequalities or start to dismantle some of those systems until we understand how we got here and what they're built on. And we've got such a tremendous legacy in Pittsburgh of the folks who've come before us, who've done this hard work, particularly folks fighting for freedom and equality, and doing that through things like philanthropy, through organizational building, institution building. So I think helping us understand not only the shoulders that we're standing on, but how we wound up with the systems that we've got, honoring that past, but also understanding it is just a tremendously important part of doing the work, as we would say today.
You know, this idea of what's old is new really strikes us, I think, in the arc of the book, that so many of the issues that Pittsburghers faced historically are back at us today, unresolved and much laid bare by the killing of George Floyd, by COVID, by disparities in healthcare and so many things. We have a question here about that related to Associated Charities, but I'd like to open this question up to all of you. Some of what we saw in COVID and what we're seeing in the activism of the moment is really focused on mutual aid and awareness and agency within communities to really galvanize support. Is there something about the series of crises we've just experienced that either makes the federated model once again appealing to donors, especially for those of modern means, or maybe giving circles or collective action? Let me broaden it beyond the federated model to say, is there more of an appetite for collective action now because of the period of time in which we find ourselves and the foment of the last 24 months? I don't know how you feel about that, both of you.
Well, Kathy, I thought you were going a slightly different with that question.
Go ahead, Jessie.
Go ahead, Jessie.
As you were asking that question, I guess I was starting to think about, right, the legacies of white supremacy and racism in all of our structures, right, not just within philanthropy. But as you and I have talked about in the past, right, I think people might be surprised at the extent to which some of that legacy is built into our philanthropic legacy here in Pittsburgh. I think the biggest example in my chapter, right, when I was thinking about the story of Mary Shenley, right, the Shenley family money came from owning enslaved humans, right? Her father owned humans here in Pittsburgh. We're talking about Northern slavery, and her grandfather. So as we start to think about where that money came from, the legacy of that, how do we acknowledge that? How do we think about reparations or the role of organizations today in having that conversation? So that's sort of where I was thinking your question might go. We're starting to pose the question of helping us contextualize the current moment that we're in. But that is very much a part of the story that I think we need to wrestle with as we imagine, what resources can do and how we put those together.
Yeah, I was just coming from one that was in the chat, but I think that is the question of the moment. The field is beginning to reckon with its past and with its role in both accumulating its wealth and how that was gotten, and what it needs to do to be more inclusive and to rectify some of those things. So, Tony, I wonder if you have some thoughts about that and the ways that you see philanthropists wading into this territory right now, either through reflection or action.
So, super pragmatic, slightly cynical answer. There's a whole lot of talk. There's definitely an increased amount of curiosity and questioning. How much practice has actually changed in the field of philanthropy is yet to be determined. I think we're too early, especially for community foundations and family foundations and large institutional private foundations, probably for United Ways and federated charities. You're having to move a whole bunch of brains and minds and attitudes at once. So it's a slow process. And we need to keep lifting up the stories of foundations who've made, or funders who've made progress on these kinds of racial reckoning issues, and tell stories of families who've gotten it or have made some movements to families and community foundations who've added new voices to their boards or decision-making processes, to small foundations who are turning on a dime to be much more responsive. So the stories are out there, but I don't know if you can call it a statistical trend yet. So lots of good storytelling. Certainly the collective action piece is happening outside formal philanthropy at a much more elevated rate, like we talked about before, right? Mutual aid societies, collective action through political movements, collective action through crowdfunding campaigns, through social movements of some kind. All that's happening a lot. We just don't track it as well as we do 501c3 work or foundation work.
So it kind of speaks to the need to continue to tell stories, to elevate the inquiry, and to engage people, and to see how and where it leads to action. It does, I've had a number of people say to me, well, history is really not relevant to the field today. And Jessie, I was so relieved when you made an impassioned plea for the need to understand how we got to today. And the way we do that is through history. I wonder if you both would speak about that. And then we do have another question here about women's religious giving. But I want to ask you both about the value to today's philanthropists and donors of seeing the past.
Well, I did already give my plea. Tony, you may want to weigh in on your view of the history here, but I certainly don't think that we can tackle the problems that we have today without an understanding of the history. And I would also add that, one of the things that I'm encouraged by is the increasing emphasis on intersectionality. And I think that there's a real history of starting to understand that we can't take apart these systems and only do, for instance, gender, and only do race, and only work on poverty, right? That these things are so connected, which of course is the insight of intersectionality, which would not have been a term that people 100 years ago would have used, right? It comes to us from Black women theorists only as recently as the 80s, really. But I'm so encouraged by the way that looking at the history of those things helps us really do the work intersectionally now. And I'm really struck by the strength of the foundations and other donors who are really using that concept and applying it to their work.
And Tony, I think you have examples of that, right, in your chapter even.
I mean, the short answer to your question is any respectable tome or guidebook on strategic philanthropy, intentional philanthropy says you need to understand the context in which you're working. And that context includes the history of the problem and the attempted solutions and the failed solutions and the struggles of people who are working at it from grassroots up and tops down into it. And so the more you know that, the more you know how to make an intelligent decision about what you want to do with your money in current times or in future times.
I do feel an obligation to ask a question that came in from our audience about where we would position women's religious charities, often part of the background history of nonprofits and foundations, specifically Catholic ones like the Sisters of Mercy, who founded Mercy Hospital, took over orphanages. Would these only be considered entry points for women, those kinds of religious, faith-based activities? And does it make the partner question more complex? Our colleague asks here.
Yeah, an interesting question in the Catholic context, given sort of the patriarchal structures of the organized Catholic Church, for sure, that you have to contend with when you're thinking about equality types of questions around partnerships. But I think the point still stands, right? Just the incredible engagement of women in those organizations and nuns, right? I mean, remember, I'm always struck by the incredible institution building that nuns, several orders of nuns have done, obviously here in Pittsburgh, but again, nationally, looking at that story. But I do think, being a historian of gender and thinking about those systems, including patriarchy, right? There's an inflection through all organized religion, not just Catholicism, that muddies that question a bit.
I'm sorry, I have to look at the clock now and draw us to a close. And I want to say that we could continue this conversation, and I believe it's imperative that we do continue this conversation about the tools of advocacy and the notions of agency that exist through philanthropy, how it changed roles, how it sought to change Pittsburgh. And I want to thank both Jessie and Tony for joining us today, and for all of you for being with us. Our book, A Gift of Belief, Philanthropy and the Forging of Pittsburgh, is now available in paperback, I'm thrilled to say. And you can get it online through a number of sources, or through the University of Pittsburgh Press, or at City of Asylum. I hope you'll consider joining us again next week as we talk to 4 more authors from A Gift of Belief, when we look at the transformation of Pittsburgh and the role of philanthropy and doing that. And so I take away many lessons today from our conversation, but most of all, my gratitude to Tony and to Jessie for your excellent work, and to all of you for being interested in exploring the power of philanthropy as it relates to Pittsburgh and the stories yet to come. So thank you all for joining us. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.